Absolutely. Here's a 300-word powerful opening hook designed to immediately grab your viewer's attention and keep them watching until the very end. It's written to be delivered in a compelling, emotionally charged tone with zero fluff, direct, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. You're about to hear something no one's ever told you. Not your parents, not your partner, not your friends. And once you hear it, you won't be able to unhear it. Because this isn't just another motivational video. This is the truth most people are too uncomfortable to say out loud. And it's the reason so many men are silently disappearing in front of your eyes, while everyone keeps clapping for how strong they look. What if I told you that your silence is doing more damage than your words ever could? What if I told you that by not reaching out, you're confirming a fear that's been growing inside someone for years, maybe decades? This isn't about relationships. This is about something deeper, something primal. What happens to a man when no one checks on him? When people only come around when he's useful? When love becomes a transaction? When care becomes a performance? And eventually he stops expecting anything at all? You think he's okay. That's what he wants you to believe. But I promise you, the ones who never ask for help are the ones you should be most worried about. Dusk. So don't scroll. Don't click away. Because if you care about your brother, your boyfriend, your father, your friend, even yourself as a man, you need to hear this. You need to understand what silence is really saying. And by the end of this video, you'll never see a strong man the same way again. This might hurt, but it could save someone you love. You see, people often assume that silence is neutral. That if they don't say something hurtful, if they don't lash out or criticize, if they simply do nothing, then they've done no damage. But here's the truth, and it's uncomfortable: silence is never empty. There's a phrase people love to say, check on your strong friends. It's catchy, it's true. And almost no one actually does it, because we're conditioned, almost trained, to believe that the people who are holding it together don't need holding, that the ones who always show up for others somehow have someone showing up for them. But here's the reality, and it's painful to admit. The strong ones are often the most neglected, not because people don't care about them, but because those people assume strength means self-sufficiency. That strength means no need, that the one who gives the most must be the most full. But giving doesn't mean full. In fact, in many cases, giving is what people do instead of receiving. It's how they survive the absence of care. It's how they avoid looking at their own unmet needs by focusing on everyone else's. And nowhere is this more visible than in men, because when a man has been emotionally neglected, whether as a child, a partner, or a friend, he learns something dangerous. That love has a condition, and that condition is strength. So what does he do? He becomes a provider, a protector, a solution to everyone's problem but his own. He becomes the guy you go to when your world is falling apart, but you never think to ask him how his world is holding up. And he doesn't complain, because he's been taught, sometimes explicitly, that complaining equals weakness, that vulnerability is unattractive, that if he asks for support, he becomes a burden. So instead of reaching out, he becomes excellent at hiding in plain sight, productive, present. But emotionally starving, you see, we applaud emotional stoicism in men. We call it resilience. We call it maturity. But what we're really often seeing is suppression, not healing, not peace, just a constant internal effort to keep it together so he can keep being the strong one for everyone else. And what happens when someone is always strong for others but never held themselves? They start believing their value only exists in how much they can offer, that their worth is transactional, and that if they ever stopped performing, they would stop being loved. Think about that. Think about what it means to walk through life believing that the moment you drop the ball, no one's going to pick it up for you. That if you fall apart, there's no net. That you can be surrounded by people and still feel entirely alone. This is the emotional world of so many men. And because they don't express it in words, People don't realize how deep the damage goes. They look at the guy who never cries and think, he's got it together. They look at the one who's always working, always busy, always productive, and think he's focused. But what they're actually seeing is someone who never learned how to be held, because no one ever offered to hold him. And here's where it gets even harder to swallow. Most people only reach out to men when they need something: advice, support, help, money, protection, problem solving. Rarely just to say, I was thinking of you, or is there anything you need right now? It's not that they don't care. It's that they've bought into the lie that the strong ones don't need to be cared for. And so he learns to stop expecting it. He builds emotional armor. He keeps showing up, but inside he's operating on a loop. Be strong. Stay useful. Don't let them see you tired, because if they do, they might leave. This is what we've done to our men. We've trained them to perform strength instead of embodying wholeness. And then we wonder why so many of them are emotionally distant, chronically stressed, or silently suffering. So let me say something that should be obvious, but too often isn't. The appearance of strength does not mean the absence of pain. And if the only people you check on are the ones who show their struggle, you're not loving people, you're reacting to symptoms. Real love isn't reactive, it's intentional. It looks at the person who never asks for help and says, I'm not going to wait for you to break to show up. Because the ones who never fall apart in front of you, they often fall apart when you're not looking. And sometimes the difference between someone continuing to hold it all together and finally being able to exhale is a single message that says, you don't have to be strong right now. I'm here. That's it. That's all it takes to break the illusion and remind someone that their worth doesn't live in how much they carry. So the next time you catch yourself saying, he's good, he's always good, stop. And ask yourself, it's always saying something. And when you don't reach out to a man, especially a man who's learned not to ask for love, your silence isn't received as peace. It's received as proof. Proof that he's alone. Proof that people only show up when they want something. Proof that connection is conditional. Most people never hear what goes on in a man's mind when he's left in that silence. They only see his behavior. He pulls back. He stops texting, pours himself into work. He gets distant. And they assume he's fine, or worse, that he doesn't care. But we forget something fundamental. Men have been trained socially, emotionally, psychologically, for generations to treat connection as a reward they must earn, not a need they're allowed to have. So when no one checks in, when no one asks how he's doing, when no one says, "Hey, I thought about you today," he doesn't interpret that as people being busy. He interprets it as confirmation. Confirmation that he's only worth something when he's performing, when he's producing, when he's giving. Because the moment he's just being, no achievement, no emotional labor, no effort, he disappears from people's radar. That's the cost of silence. It doesn't just echo. It rewrites the narrative in his head. And we need to understand something about human psychology here. When people don't receive feedback, the brain doesn't default to optimism. It doesn't say, well, I'm sure they love me and they're just too overwhelmed to show it. No. It defaults to fear, to insecurity, to self-doubt. And for men, that doubt is often buried under years of emotional self-reliance. Not because they wanted to be independent, but because they were taught to be, conditioned to be. Don't cry. Handle it like a man. No one's coming to save you. So when the silence comes, when there's no message, no call, no invitation, it doesn't land in a vacuum. It lands in a history of moments where vulnerability wasn't safe, where being needy got punished, where feelings made him the target of shame. That's what silence triggers. And here's the part that most people miss. Men won't always say this. They won't tell you they're hurt. They won't tell you they feel forgotten. Because for them, to admit that would be to expose the very thing they've spent their whole lives trying to hide. That beneath the strength is someone deeply, painfully human, So they'll keep showing up strong, they'll keep smiling, they'll keep carrying others. But on the inside, something shifts. They start believing that no one's coming. They stop expecting love that's freely given. And eventually, they stop reaching out too. Not because they don't want connection, but because they've concluded they're not worthy of it unless they're constantly earning it. And that's the silent contract we don't realize we're creating. I'll care about you as long as you're impressive, as long as you keep giving, as long as you never become inconvenient. But what happens when he gets tired, when he's in need, when the strong one starts to break? Does anyone notice? Or has he convinced everyone, including himself, that he doesn't need to be reached? The truth is, most people say, check on your strong friends. But they only do it when it's trending. They only do it when the silence becomes a crisis. By then, it's often too late, because the damage silence causes isn't always loud. It's quiet, it happens gradually, like erosion. And by the time you notice, parts of him have already been washed away. So if there's someone in your life you haven't reached out to, someone who seems fine, who acts strong, who never complains, understand that silence doesn't mean safety, and distance doesn't mean disinterest. Sometimes the strongest people have simply stopped expecting to be seen because the world trained them to survive without being cared for. And maybe it's time we untrain them, not with grand gestures, but with a simple message: I see you. I'm here. You don't have to earn my care. Because the moment you break that silence, genuinely, intentionally, you don't just reconnect with a man. You restore something deeper, his belief that he's worth loving even when he's not performing. And that can change everything. One of the most misunderstood things about men, especially emotionally self-contained men, is this idea that when they stop talking, they've simply become distant. That when they withdraw, it's because they've shut off or checked out or stopped caring. But that's not always true. In fact, silence in a man isn't always an act of detachment. More often, it's the product of defeat. See, there's this hidden threshold that nobody really talks about, especially not men themselves. It's the point where a man decides not to expect anything anymore. Not because he doesn't want connection, but because he's convinced it's not safe to hope for it. And that decision doesn't come loudly. It doesn't show up as some dramatic exit. It comes quietly, like the slow closing of a door he's left open for too long. That's what people miss. A man doesn't just become quiet. He goes quiet, not because he lacks emotion, but because he's tired of trying to speak in a language that no one seems to hear. You have to understand how we got here. When a man opens up, when he lets himself be vulnerable, when he dares to ask for closeness or care, and that vulnerability is ignored, minimized, or even just met with indifference, it doesn't teach him to try again. It teaches him to never do it again. He learns that silence is safer. He learns that expectations lead to disappointment. And worst of all, he starts to believe that maybe he was asking for too much in the first place. So instead of becoming more expressive, he becomes more internal. Instead of speaking up about what he needs, he lowers the need altogether. And from the outside, it just looks like emotional distance. But inside, it's resignation. He's not pulling away because he doesn't care. He's pulling away because he cares too much to keep getting hurt. And here's the truth that might sting a little. When a man stops expecting to be heard, he doesn't get quieter, he gets colder. Not because he's angry, but because hope feels like too much to carry alone. Now you might be thinking, well, if he needs something, he should just say it. But here's what most people don't understand about the male emotional experience. He did say it. Maybe not in your language. Maybe not with tears and long conversations. But he said it in other ways. In how often he reached out. In the way he showed up when you needed something. In the things he did that he never asked for in return. Those were his bids for connection. His ways of saying, I want to be seen. I want to matter. I want to be cared for too. But when those things go unnoticed or unreciprocated for too long, he doesn't always ask for more. He just starts to expect less. And this is where the emotional disconnection happens, not in the absence of love, but in the withholding of expectation. Because when someone expects nothing, they also stop allowing things in, not because they don't want love, but because they're now afraid of the cost that comes with wanting it. You can't truly connect with someone who's decided that connection isn't available to them. And many men, consciously or unconsciously, have made that decision, not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation. It's easier to convince yourself that you don't need anything than to keep hoping for something that never comes. So they stop reaching, they stop expressing. They build walls, not because they want to keep others out, but because they need something to lean on when no one else shows up. And this is the tragedy no one sees. He didn't stop speaking because he had nothing to say. He stopped speaking because he believed no one would listen. So if you're someone who genuinely cares about the men in your life, your partner, your brother, your father, your friend, don't just wait for him to crack open and tell you what he needs. Start by making it safe for him to even have needs in the first place. That means noticing when he goes quiet, noticing when the smile becomes more routine than real, noticing when the man who always shows up starts hesitating. It means reaching out not when something's wrong, but before it ever gets to that point, because the moment he stops expecting to be heard is the moment the relationship, any relationship, starts dying from the inside out. And he won't tell you when that moment comes. He'll just decide in silence that it already did. So don't wait for the silence to become deafening. Be the voice that reminds him you are allowed to need something. And you don't have to be alone to have it. That's how trust is built again. Not with big declarations, but with consistent, quiet proof that being heard doesn't have to be earned, that being human is enough. Absolutely. Here's the 750-word segment expanding on key point 4, written to flow naturally within the larger speech, using a psychologically grounded and emotionally intelligent tone. Intellectual but human. Think of it like you're sitting across from your audience, cutting through the noise with something they've never really stopped to examine. We live in a culture that's conditioned us to respond to need, not to presence. We check on people when they look like they're breaking. We offer support when there's an emergency. We rush in when someone cries for help. And men, especially, are masters of this. They've been trained from a young age not to express need, not to look weak, not to appear vulnerable. So they adapt. They learn to live without asking. And as a result, they become incredibly easy to overlook because they make it easy. But that doesn't mean they don't want to be cared for. It doesn't mean they don't have needs. It means they've internalized a brutal rule. Only show up emotionally if it's safe. And for a lot of men, it's never felt safe. So what happens when you love someone who doesn't ask for anything? If your love is reactive, you'll wait for a signal. You'll wait until he's visibly struggling. You'll wait until the signs are undeniable. And by the time you show up, his belief that people only love him when he's broken will have already been confirmed. Because that's what reactive love does. It waits for pain before it speaks. It waits for a breakdown before it offers presence. And that kind of love doesn't feel like love. It feels like management. We often confuse support with connection, but real connection, real intimacy, is built when you show someone they're worthy of your care, even when they don't look like they need it, even when they're strong, even when they're composed, even when everything seems fine. Because let's be honest, checking in on someone who's clearly upset isn't the hard part. That's expected. That's normal. The real test is whether you reach out when there's no obvious crisis, when there's no visible signal, when there's no clear reason. Because that's when it becomes meaningful. That's when it becomes love, not just obligation. And this is where so many people get stuck, especially in relationships. They wait to offer love until there's a visible emotional need. But by doing that, they're not actually connecting. They're managing the situation. They're responding to symptoms instead of nourishing the person underneath. Think about that for a second. If the only time someone checks on you is when you're falling apart, you start to feel like your pain is what earns you attention. You begin to believe that the only way to be loved is to be in crisis. And that belief doesn't just show up in romantic relationships. It shows up in friendships, in family, even at work. You'll see men who keep their struggles buried under their success. Men who never let anyone see behind the curtain because they've noticed that the moment they stop being strong, people start disappearing. So they learn to perform, not just in career or fitness or achievement, but in their emotional lives too. They perform being okay because being okay keeps people comfortable. And that's the quiet tragedy. Most people say they want vulnerability, but they only know how to respond to visible vulnerability. They're not trained to recognize the invisible kind, the kind that never asks. That's why the strongest love, the kind that heals, is proactive. It doesn't wait for pain. It doesn't need permission. It says, I see you even when you're silent. I care even when you're composed. I choose you even when you don't need me. That kind of love is rare because it requires awareness. It requires emotional responsibility, and it demands that we become more than just reactive caretakers. We become as intentional givers. We stop asking, what does he need from me? And we start asking, how can I remind him he's not alone, even when he says nothing? Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is show up before someone breaks. Not to fix anything, not to offer solutions, just to